At first glance, it seems like it would be really easy or simple to define the definition between a conversation that is for the purpose of playing an RPG or what we do when we play an RPG, and another kind of conversation, another exchange of information. However, once you start to look at it, it becomes really slippery and a lot harder to define. And honestly, the closest I could get would be is that is an RPG conversation is a conversation about an imagined situation that affects the imagined situation. And it does so in a way that this final imagined situation is not for the purpose of making anything else, like a book or a movie. Rather, this conversation about an imagined situation that affects the imagined situation is the end. There's nothing that emerges after that, or at least there's no goal for something else to emerge from it. In terms of what kinds of information should or shouldn't be included in the conversation, that really depends upon the game, depends upon the group, it depends upon the needs of the individual people. I mean, certainly at the end of the day, the talking about the imagined situation itself and affecting it, the talk that actually affects it, that's the part that's actually playing an RPG. There's all kinds of adjacent talk that might happen, which may or may not be relevant to the information we're exchanging that affects the imagined situation. You see how convoluted this gets? But there might be an awful lot of other talk that's just adjacent or completely irrelevant. Is including that in the conversation making it not an RPG session? It might make it an annoying one, but it doesn't necessarily make it not an RPG session. But obviously, the information that should be included in an RPG session are the types of information that are about this imagined situation and that may or may not affect it, but are relevant to it. As far as the medium, the medium of the conversation itself has a tremendous impact and effect on how an RPG feels, at least in my experience. It's hard to imagine where no one is speaking or providing an exchange of information in words. I mean, I suppose we could just move tokens back and forth and never actually talk to each other, but that really wouldn't, at least for me, be anything resembling a role-playing game. That said, how we communicate has a huge impact. If we're speaking face-to-face, that has an enormous impact because partly it's not all verbal. We get a lot more body language, which I think is part of it, and facial expressions. We can do just audio and miss a lot of that. We can do stuff over Zoom, and we try to get as much of it as we possibly can, but it's a little bit different. And then play by post, where you're writing in some kind of form or email, it feels different. There's less of a dynamic back and forth, if you will, and a lot more time to think about it. So all of these methods qualify, but how we actually communicate, what the medium actually looks like, that can have a huge impact upon it. And that's not even going into like what we say or how we say it or the rules for talking. Because there could be a lot of rules for talking. Are we taking turns? Is there some kind of structure or not a structure? I almost put that, the idea of the structure in the definition of the communication for a role-playing game. But some role-playing games don't have a structure at all. So you really can't say that. You can say that most do. So beyond how we're communicating in words, be it writing or verbally, the procedure of the particular RPG will have a definite impact on how it feels, on what transpires, on how quickly it transpires, if there's rules for negotiation, etc. And if we take turns, or however we do it, the procedure actually dictates the structure of the conversation. And so, of course, that has an effect on the feeling of the imagined situation, and in some cases, the outcome of it. But this medium of communicating to each other in words, however we do it, serves the activity of role-playing games because it's just so wide open. There's so many possibilities because it's not just a short set of things we can do. It's enormous. So it's vital. Now, is conversation itself sufficient to make something a role-playing game? I think so. Your level of satisfaction may vary, but it doesn't take too much to realize that we could play a role-playing game just talking and never use anything else. No maps, no minis, no dice, no external props, or any items of any kind. We can even do this and inject things like chance and randomization. Something even as simple as your character has a 60% chance to do something, and so I, as your game master, tell you to choose an integer between 0 and 9, and I've already decided that 0, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are failures. Or 0, 4, 5, and 6. Well, now, if you choose any of the other numbers, you've succeeded, and we don't have to roll dice or anything like that. So yeah, conversation itself can be entirely sufficient. And if I look at most sessions, it tends to be. That takes up the lion's share of what we're doing. So what do we make of the system? The system and the mechanics. And the system is really, at least in my mind, the mechanics and the procedures, all the rules, all the stuff. Is that a participant in the conversation, or is that something else? And I've thought about this particular subject for a long time prior to this discussion, and I believe the system is a participant in the conversation. I don't believe it's something different. It's a slightly different one, but There's the idea that we can just ask questions, and it tells us answers. We look to it to tell us what to do or how to have the conversation. So it tells us, we say, well, what should we do? Or how should I do this? And it tells us how we should do this. So I believe the system is an active, albeit strange, participant in the conversation. It's probably easiest for me to conceptualize the system or the part of the system that's the most active part in the conversation to be the dice, if we're using dice, because those are the plastic gods, if you will. And so we ask them a question, it tells us the answer. And so the system, it's a very, very active as a participant. But then looking at the entire thing, the system as a whole, the procedures of the play, well, they tell us how to behave. And so sometimes we ask the system questions and it tells us the answers. And it's really not a perfect analogy, but it's a little bit like a moderator at a debate. There might be other ways to describe it, the system, but it's certainly always there. And it's certainly always participating in some way in the conversation, or at least guiding it. You know what I mean?
The main difference between a verbal exchange and RPG is mostly the idea of the sacred and the profane. So, in real life, formal verbal exchange, you talk about mundane stuff. You talk about profane stuff. You talk about, meaningful things that are very practical most of the time, relating to your real life. But when you are in an RPG setting or situation or play, the conversation is curated and it becomes sacred. It becomes, we tend, most games and most people tend to take away the mundane stuff. It's kind of like strip it out, even from the rules. Not all the time, not all the group, but most. And it becomes it's curated by the genre. It becomes sacred around aesthetics and themes and genre, and there are always something at stakes. In when you have a normal conversation, sometimes it's just a conversation, it's just a dialogue. There's not always something big at stakes, and that drives the momentum kind of thing. So I would say that's the main difference, and the most important one is the role play. When you are having a verbal exchange with someone, you are not in character, you are yourself, and you are not trying to embody something that you're not the same time as you're speaking. So it makes a huge distinction between the kind of conversation. The type of information uh, is gonna change depending on the game, depending on the social contract, depending on genre, you know. So it's gonna vary. Um, but it's very hard. I would make them in three categories, because and I will make some distinctions. First, you know, full 100% role play with no out of character talk and no system mechanical talk is very rare. It's stuff that we did a little bit together. I did myself a little bit with some people, mostly in solo sessions, mostly with people who know the rules by heart, mostly with very, very short sessions. Otherwise, you're gonna have some questions, you're gonna have some mechanical talk, and you're gonna have all kinds of stuff. So you have the stuff that's in character, you have the mechanical stuff, and you have the out of character questions. That's mostly what constitute the informations that you will most likely find in an RPG session. The talking and writing enable the playing of RPGs because it convey information. You share and you communicate, information. You share information, in character by talking. And you can, if you are in person or if you are online with a chat, you can write stuff on the side that can, be shared around with the participant. So, and video, you know. So it's, I would say that That's how I would say that those are the medium that will constitute RPG, and that will constitute the conversation aspect as well. So writing, reading, talking, those kinds of things. You don't need anything to have an RPG session. You can have an RPG session pretty much anywhere, anytime, just by talking with no roles, and it would work. And it can be super fun and super intense. Uh, it most likely will be short, but you can do that. You can do that anywhere. So you can very like distillate it. You can make it very, very minimalistic with just talking. Of course, mechanics gets in the way. We want to have some because it's fun. Uh, so system is gonna be important at some point to kind of have a randomizer. But yes, we can. I think it's all the above. So I think it's part of the conversation. I think it's a tool, and I think it is also the information that is exchanged. Because as the GM or as the player, depending on the game, you will have sometimes to mention. You have some games out there that demands that you talk about the mechanics because you need to mention it before using it. uh, you know, and then the GM needs to give you either an obstacle or some kind of an information or maybe a bonus or a malices or something. And, it becomes part of the conversation. It's not alienated from the conversation, you know? When it comes to this whole topic, you know, the conversation is an umbrella word. Is an umbrella word to say here. It's a spiritual kind of conversation. It's a conversation about stuff that are not real. It's a conversation that is mechanically curated, and aesthetically curated as well. And there's a social contract to this conversation as well. So these are all the elements that should be in this conversation.
In an RPG conversation, all participants do not simply exchange information. They are collaboratively constructing an emergent shared narrative within the imagined play space, defined by the boundary of rules and roles. Role spelled ROLE in this case. The roles and rules combined with the TTRPG's structured fictional nature make up the bulk of the primary differences between a general conversation and one that is carried out during a tabletop RPG. Some of the information that should be included are things like the fictional content. This is the description of the world, the characters, and the events within the context of the imagined play space. In the case of character dialogue and NPC and PC exchanges, it's often not just what gets said by a player that the character says in game, but how the character and player both make inflections or enunciate or express what they are actually saying as dialogue. Also, we have character actions and decisions. Players not only state what their characters do within the game world, but may also include didactic reasoning behind their actions or decisions. Of course, game mechanics include things like, but are not limited to, dice rolls, rules invocations, and system specific terminology that define or inform outcomes within the context of play. We also have the influence of explicit and implicit scene framing and transitions. This is where the players or the system provide the structure for when and how certain scenes shift within the context of the action taking place during the game. We also have conflict resolution. A TTRPG's conversation does need to include resolving of challenges through mechanics or narrative agreement or fiat. Now, the types of information that should not really be included or at least minimized are things like table chatter and unstructured small talk. RPGs are social interactions. However, we all can commonly agree that extended, unrelated discussions to the game can be disruptive. Now, real world logistics are probably not necessary and are definitely not part of play. So things like making the schedule, who's going to buy the pizza, and other unrelated subjects, often seen as small talk, are typical of pre or post game activities that really should be kept outside of the structured playtime and an actual RPG conversation. Now, out of character disruptions, such as excessive meta discussions not in service to the game, can break immersion in the imagined play space. So, for question one, the dual functions of emergent narrative construction and rule enforcement make a TTRPG conversation more structured than a casual one, but more open-ended than a formal debate. Conversation forms the core functional medium of RPGs, enabling players to collaboratively imagine, describe, and negotiate emergent fiction. Whereas games that rely on visual and mechanical elements structure or even dictate the interactions, as is the case with board games, card games, and video games. RPGs primarily rely on spoken communication to establish a shared understanding of and within an imagined play space. As a primarily verbal freeform, free Kriegspiel or diceless game, for example here, The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen or Amber Diceless, can function without physical game aids. Now, specifically dice. However, many RPGs benefit from additional supporting media that help to structure play, enhance clarity, and track progress. As gamers, we often make the distinction that we play a pen and paper role-playing game. So conceptually, a completely verbal RPG can work if it includes some of the following: rules enforcement by shared understanding in the case of so-called storytelling games where outcomes are agreed upon. We also have memory-based state tracking where players and GMs recall established facts about the world details. We do need some minimalist resolution mechanics like a simple yes or no arbitration, a fiat, or voting process, often referred to as karma. However, we cannot discount the value derived during play from randomizers, which add unpredictability to outcomes. And character sheets, these assist with tracking stats, abilities, and progression. Extended or long form play often needs written notes or logs to help maintain its consistency. So to extend the concept of it, conversation is the primary minimal functioning medium, but most games and participants use supporting material for clarity, fairness, and added complexity. The system in any specific RPG is unique, though not sentient, yet it affects the conversation as significantly as a player. Although not considered a role-playing game, a good example here from the board game world would be Gloomhaven, which has a so-called artificial intelligence or flowchart, which represents the actions that would be taken by or dictated by the game master in such a case. Depending on how it is engaged, the system functions as a participant in play, a supporting medium, and part of the information exchange. So, for example, in Apocalypse World, the move structure forces players to phrase actions in specific ways, i.e., create a trigger for a move, such as when you go aggro on someone, affecting how they express their decisions. Another example is in Dread. The Jenga Tower dictates tension, altering the pacing and style of speech as players hesitate before taking turns. Some further examples of how the game system affects the conversation may be through a token economy in games like The Quiet Year or Dialect. By limiting speech by using tokens or actions, like in the game The Quiet Year, players can ask questions but can't answer them themselves. This changes the nature and flow of the conversation, creating structured silence. Another game to consider here is Burning Wheel, which uses beliefs and instincts as a system, pushing characters to speak in ways that reflect their personal drives. Hillfolk, also known as the drama system, structures social interactions around emotional stakes rather than dice rolls. In the game 10 Candles, it uses ritualistic phrases. These things are true to create a structured, eerie style of conversation. Dialect, a game based around language, focuses on evolving language and how words shape group identity. And while the system does not directly communicate, it does influence how the conversation unfolds, responding to player input, forcing adaptation, similar to the way any other participant in the game would. Now, as a framework that structures how conversations happen, much like grammar shapes language, it dictates when a conversation must pause for a resolution, when you need to make a dice roll, ability check, how conversation should be structured. Is it turn-based or free-form? This also includes the tone and expectations of dialogue. Is this a rules-heavy game? Is it very tactical? Is it narrative-driven? Is it character-focused? Because of this, the system acts as a channel through which the game's conversation flows, constraining and dictating it without directly speaking. At its simplest level, the system exists within the conversation as rules, results, and adjudication passed between participants. It is referenced much like a shared document or authority external to the conversation. An example here is, I rolled a 16 to hit. It's pure informational exchange. Another one is, the game says I have advantage, so I'll roll twice. It relies on the system as a codified reference. When treated this way, the system is a source of structural information that players and the GM interpret to communicate back and forth. Beyond a verbal exchange, TTRPGs include significant internal decision-making, self-talk, and visualization, which is often referred to in wider circles as intrapersonal communication. This is where the system plays an even deeper role. In solo play, where the player acts as both audience and participant, imagining responses before externalizing, the system serves as an interactive counterpart, shaping the internal decision-making process. These prompts or signals act as replies during interpersonal communication. And before speaking, players weigh mechanics, recall story elements, and visualize the outcomes as part of the player thought process. What's my best move here? What will my character really say? Would they really do that? Typically, the GM internally processes multiple interpretations before narrating. This is part of the game master adjudication. Should the NPC react with hostility is a good example. Because the system dictates possible actions and outcomes, the system acts as a silent conversational force. It becomes part of the player's internal thought process, influencing the words and decisions and actions that they ultimately express. Now, I recognize internal dialogue as part of an RPG conversation. During solo play, the system functions as an even more active participant in shaping play. The system is not just one thing. It's multiple things simultaneously. It's a participant because it influences the conversation like any other entity would. It acts as a supporting medium because it structures and directs the dialogue. It is part of the information exchange because its rules and results are discussed in play. And it acts as a force in intrapersonal communication, shaping the player thought process before the words are even spoken. This interplay makes system an essential, ever-present element in RPG conversations, one that shapes both spoken and unspoken aspects of play.